Hello, my name is Stapleton-Goddard. I am the Freshwater Delivery Manager with the Wiltshire Wildlife Trust, and today I'm here to talk to you about natural flood management, particularly about natural flood management in the farm landscape using wetlands and trees. So starting off, what is natural flood management? So in essence, it's using natural features and natural processes to intercept and store water, ideally before it reaches urban environments or rivers where it can cause flooding a bit further downstream. So some of the key things that we'll be looking at today are hydraulic roughness and natural features and natural processes and how they each work to slow the flow of runoff into rivers. So this is a diagram of how water moves across the landscape, both back into the atmosphere and then from when it hits the ground as rain and then into rivers. So we've got things like overland flow, obviously quite visible, you can see flow pathways in that, but equally the infiltration and the through flow through the soil and the groundwater is equally quite an important aspect that isn't often looked at in natural flood management. So one of the key ways of understanding flooding is this, which is called a hydrograph. So the blue lines represent peak rainfall, and the green line is peak discharge. So imagine this is the amount of water that's passing a certain point in a river. So natural flood management is looking at ways about how you can get either this peak to be lower or this peak to be further this way to give you more time to react to flood events. And yeah, we'll look at ways in which we identify where we'll put these interventions and some of the interventions that we'll actually use. So yeah, where do we begin? So it all starts off with a map. So we will start with desk studies and models. So these are statistical or computer models for how water moves across the landscape. And we can also look at some historic maps. So this is a modern Ordnance Survey map, but some of the historic maps will give us clues about where features used to be wet, where there used to be ponds, wetlands, where rivers used to be, and then from that we can start to build a picture of where the flooding is actually coming from. So one of the best tools is Scalgo. You can put in different rainfall scenarios, so high rainfall, low rainfall, and it will give you these lines. So these are flow pathways, so these areas where the computer thinks water is accumulating and then running down into this main channel here. So some of these are quite obvious, so you can see down ditches and hedgerows where you've got flow pathways, but some of these smaller ones across fields, they're not necessarily so obvious. Similar to that, we can also use SciMap, which looks at fine sediment erosion risk, and fine sediment erosion risk and flooding are often quite interlinked, mostly because it's based on slope. So based on the SciMap outputs, we can identify hotspots of flooding and runoff. So these areas in the headwaters, these more red areas, those are areas indicated as high risk. So those are some of the areas that we can focus on for our surveys to see if the models are true. And if they are true, we can focus our efforts in mitigating those problems, ideally at source, before it has time to gather velocity and extra flow as it gets down towards urban areas. So on site, once we've identified some of the key areas, we will then look to do walkover surveys, ideally in the wet weather, because that is a great time to start highlighting some of the flow pathways. Generally the models are pretty good, but often you get somewhat ephemeral ones, particularly in arable fields, which aren't picked up on a model, or they might be in slightly different places each year. So this is a prime example of a flow pathway. So you've got a slight slope coming down this way, and then a very clear erosion path, both in this one, and then coming down here, and then into a ditch. So once we've identified those, again, what do we do to help mitigate that? So yes, more examples of flow pathways. They can be quite small, as this one here, but they can get quite a head of steam and be quite severe and be a pretty large source of both fine sediment and flooding downstream. So how do we solve the problem? So starting off, we can look at some in-field interceptors. So this is on a large scale, and this works best on ephemeral streams or flow pathways, so streams and flow pathways that will only flow during high rainfall. This is quite a large scale one, but this one is a bit more farm scale, and one of the benefits of this is that because of the low impact and low footprint, this field can still be grazed and managed in more or less the same way as it was before. But as you can see in the short video, this one was taken by Bristol Avon Rivers Trust. What this log deflector is doing is it's holding that flow back and dispersing it across a wider area. So similar to this, you've got leaky dams. These would be deployed in more ditch environments or small streams that might have a permanent flow year round. And what these will do, they'll have a gap at the bottom to allow fish passage and regular flows, but as soon as that level comes up, these are increasing the friction, creating storage behind the dams, and importantly they're increasing that overall hydraulic roughness, but we'll get to that in a second. So wetlands and ponds, these are some of the NFM measures that most people think of when they think of NFM. They're quite visible, you can see them working, they're quite effective, and they can be really, really good for wildlife as well. So these are quite large retention basins, so as that diagram says, you get an inflow, the water level will come up, and then when it reaches a certain point, it will then start to outflow. So they can be designed to have a permanent head of water, they can be designed to come up in the wet weather and then disappear again, depending on the characteristics of that catchment. So the ones before were quite large scale ones, but this again is a bit more of a farm scale intervention. What you've got here is a series of stepped ponds, and this can work in a field corner, it doesn't take up an enormous amount of space. And these will fill up, and then those rock ramps there give a really good slow release of that water. And then conversely, again, you've got some of the landscape scale ones that you could deploy where you've got maybe serious flooding, or if that's just something that you want to explore for your farm. So, thinking about woodlands and hedgerows, they quite often get neglected in terms of NFM. You can't necessarily see them working in particular because a lot of the effects are below ground, but they can be a really useful and multi-benefit natural flood management technique. So buffer strips, these are really good at intercepting overland flow and also increasing soil percolation for moisture. And they can take a number of forms. So you've got this flow pathway down this shallow valley, and these are all arable fields surrounding it, and the water will flow a lot slower down this stretch than it will across those fields. And equally, if you deploy these on ditches and ditches and rivers, you are decreasing the erosion risk, and that's sediment going downstream. And if you've got fences along those ditches, you're decreasing the number of times you have to go out and fix those fences because they've washed into the river. So this is a brand new example of a cross-field hedgerow. So you've got a slope going up that way, and what happens is the water comes off here, it hits this hedge, it hits a barrier, it will then build up water behind that hedge, or the root mass of those trees and hedges will increase the percolation before it gets to the river again. So yeah, we've touched on how trees and buffer strips work, but I think this is a really clear example. So a deep root mass of a tree can increase soil percolation by up to 60 times, which is an enormous amount of water. And compared to this is an American example, but the root depth of agriculture compared to, and in this case, a native prairie grassland, but you can quite clearly see that with deeper rooting species, all of this soil is available to act as a sponge, whereas with agriculture like this, you only get the top couple of inches or so. So we touched on hydraulic roughness before. That is measured as a Manning's value of N. So the higher the value, the increased roughness and the slower in which the water travels across the landscape. So starting off with some developed areas, so places that are tarmacked or concreted over, quite a low roughness value. So water runs off quite quickly downstream. Likewise, barren lands, so this can be a similar value for something like a winter field that's been ploughed and then left barren over winter, or when we've had some of the sort of autumn rain, so when that field's been harvested, water can more or less run straight off. Compared to something like mixed forest and shrub and scrub, so tree planting and hedges, they've got some of the highest Manning's values out there because they increase the percolation through the soil, slowing the flow, and also the physical barriers that they create to intercept some of that overland flow as well. So again, these are just more diagrams of how hedges can be deployed in slightly different ways. So the diagram down the bottom, hedges across the pathway of a river, they're almost acting as dams when that river level comes up and floods. Each hedgerow is slowing that flow downstream and creating that temporary storage. And likewise, this is another example of a cross slope hedgerow, newly planted, just to limit some of that water coming straight off the field slope there. So what are some of the benefits of natural flood management techniques alongside the obvious benefits to reduction of flood risk of properties downstream? So I think drought resilience is one of the big ones. So beavers, obviously some of the best natural flood management engineers around. This is a beaver wetland in Devon, one of the famous ones, and you can quite clearly see beavers, no beavers. So we've seen more and more that farms that have deployed natural flood management techniques to keep water on their land for longer will quite often have those extra couple of weeks of grazing in the summer when maybe some of your neighbours' fields look a lot like this. So we think there definitely is a farming benefit that can be gained from natural flood management. One of the big ones is soil retention. So this is a sediment trap, obviously a man-made one, but all of this sediment was from one high flow event that washed a lot of that topsoil off a ploughed field. So natural flood management techniques, particularly hedgerows and buffer strips, will be acting in much the same way as this. Again, we touched on reduction in flood risk. So these two lines are a pre and a post intervention hydrograph. So the red is pre-restoration, so pre-natural flood management intervention deployment, and the green is after. So what you can quite clearly see is that the peak discharge in that stream is lower, and it is also quite a bit later as well. So imagine that blue line is the point at which a village floods. If we never reach that point, the village doesn't flood. So in that case, the natural flood management has been successful. Likewise, if the blue line, the purple line, is the point at which villages floods, what you've done is given that community an extra couple of hours to prepare, so deploy maybe some engineered solutions like flood barriers or to evacuate that area. Wildlife. So I think wetlands are becoming increasingly valued in terms of the farm landscapes. So we've known for decades how valuable hedgerows are, but being able to tie in some wet features as well as hedgerows, I think can have benefits to wildlife that are greater than the sum of their parts. So I suppose next, importantly, how can you get involved and how can you get funding and support to deploy some of these natural flood management techniques, particularly trees and hedges, to your farms? So the Western Forest, quite a new project operating across these areas, is now able to offer some of that funding and support to you. So forest creation, that could be pure woodland, agroforestry, mixture of the two, and they're really looking at improving the farm landscape in terms of trees, but also creating a resilient landscape as well. So how can hedges and trees help your farms become more resilient to climate change, be that drought or increasing wet weather? So this is the step-by-step of how to get involved. So it obviously starts with a site visit, then a bit of an options appraisal about what you want, what's possible, what funding can be there for, and then you get the paperwork side of things, so grant applications, like ordering trees, and then you get to plant them. So whether that's with contractors, you do it yourself, or with volunteers, they're all possible options. And then importantly, aftercare. So how can you access support to keep managing the trees that are planted through this scheme? Because that is a really important and often neglected aspect of hedges and trees. They are quite often planted and not necessarily managed to realise a lot of those benefits from that planting. So I'll leave this one up for now, but I really encourage you to get in touch with the Western Forest. We'll disseminate all the links and everything with this presentation. They're really keen for as many applications as possible. They've got quite a lot of funding to deliver these trees, so if you would like trees, hedges on your farms, I really recommend getting in touch with the Western Forest. Thank you for listening, and then if there are any questions, I'm sure you'll be able to feed that back when we send out this presentation. So look forward to hearing from you.